Great, thank you. It's great to be here this morning, and we're going to talk about performance, how to measure it, benchmarks specifically, and then a quick preview of the Ryzen PRO and how to measure benchmarks on that and performance. So let's start off. I always like to start off with a poll question here, and that is kind of what are some of the ways that you measure performance, the tools that you use. So if you just take a second there and go ahead and click on those, and I'll give you a few seconds, and then we'll take a look at that and proceed into our presentation here. All right, another second. I'm going to go ahead then and go to the next slide and see published performance. Wow, look at that. Everybody did the published performance benchmarks. That's good. So we'll talk about, what's behind that and how to measure that and what to look out for as we proceed through the presentation today. Before I get into that, let's talk a little bit about what is important for customers. We did a study with Spiceworks recently that you'll see coming out here shortly, and surveyed a group of IT professionals across a wide range of companies, from smaller companies up to larger companies, and said rate a number of different criteria and what they thought was most important. And performance, like a lot of these Meet the Experts that I do when I ask the attendees, performance always ranks at the top. It's still the number one concern for most folks looking to purchase a commercial notebook or commercial desktop. And here you can see, especially in the smaller organizations, it's a very strong driver. But even in the larger ones, it's still one of the top, or the top concern, followed by security in there. So performance being one of the top concerns, are how do you measure that? How do you spec that? How do you know you're getting the right computer that meets the performance needs of your users? So today we're going to talk a little bit about benchmarks, what makes good benchmarks, how to measure performance, and kind of some best practices, if you will. So first, let's go to kind of an old method of measuring performance, and that is, basing it on some simple processor specification. Maybe it's the CPU cache size, or the frequency, base or boost. Maybe it's even as simple as the brand or ranking or brand model number of the processor. And these are fairly simplistic and really don't cover enough of the spectrum to understand what type of performance you can expect to get. With a modern architecture, there's just so many variables that are interacting with each other. The thermal design of the platform can determine what the average frequency is over the workload. So while base and boost may be interesting, it really doesn't tell much of the story. Also, processor designs, we call it IPC, or instructions per clock. Different architectures can have different IPC rates. So while the frequency may be lower on a specific processor, its IPC may be higher. So it's getting more work done per clock cycle than a comparative processor. And therefore, even though it may have a lower frequency, it may actually outperform a processor with a higher frequency. So these are fairly crude and really, not very good indicators of what kind of performance, or more importantly, if your user is going to be satisfied with the platform that they're using. So we really need a more comprehensive view of performance than these simple specifications can provide us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what can make a good performance evaluation strategy. And there's kind of three large buckets I'll talk about. One is self-evaluation. That is, you get some platforms in and you allow the users to use it in their environment, using the applications they use every day. And this is very specific, very targeted. At the end of the day, a happy user doing their day-to-day workflows means more than any benchmark, any published performance spec, anything you might hear from the manufacturers on how great their product is. A happy user is the ultimate goal here in the end of the day. But of course, that's not always possible. That's time challenging. It can interrupt workflows, actual work getting done. So that's not always possible, especially in a larger scale. So another avenue is what we call business scripts. And you'll hear more about this in the future. AMD is developing one of these that simulates a real day, everyday workflow, utilizing Office apps, using like videos and webs and virus scanning and PDFs and file compression, and a lot of the day-to-day tasks kind of combined together. And this can also give a good reflection of user performance, expected satisfaction, without actually having to disrupt their day-to-day activities potentially. Although this has a con of it can be fairly complicated to set up. Now, I've seen a lot of our customers that may simplify this a little bit. Excel is a favorite benchmark that I've seen many customers use. That tends to be a fairly good application for both single-thread performance or multi-thread performance. So I've seen a lot of customers kind of run Excel macros, run very large spreadsheets, kind of as their proxy to this business script, a kind of a simplified version. Again, AMD is developing something we'll talk about more in the future, but a script that we can provide to customers that kind of expands this into a good day in the life of a business user. And third is what we're going to talk mostly about today, and that is benchmarks. And these are the easiest because you can load them on, you can push a button, you can get a result at the end of it. And they have some good comparative value, right? Benchmark will spit out a score of 100, and for another laptop, it might spit out a score of 150. Okay, maybe that laptop's 50% better than the first laptop. So it gives you some kind of comparative, but they don't always provide a good insight in the actual user experience. So there's not necessarily a good correlation. This gets more and more challenging as you limit the scope of the benchmarks you use. So if you can use a wider selection of benchmarks, that helps smooth out some of those specific issues that may be encountered. So let's talk a little bit about what makes a good benchmark. First of all, there's a couple common types of benchmarks. I'll kind of lump them into two large buckets, what I'll call system and application based. That is, they're testing an entire system. So your memory subsystem, your storage, your processor, your graphics, all that will kind of come into play. They give you a score that helps look at the entire system. Some are more application based. Some of those are kind of synthetic systems where they'll try to test certain elements and then compile it together. Other ones are application based, much like the scripts I mentioned a moment ago. They'll use segments or pieces of the actual applications, maybe even the actual applications themselves, to kind of try to simulate, for example, an office workload. And then the second large kind of category of benchmarks is what I'll call synthetic. These are kind of measuring the raw processor performance, maybe the raw memory bandwidth or graphics processor performance. And these tend to be a little bit narrower in scope. However, they also provide good insight into the raw processing capabilities of a particular platform that may give you some insights into future applications. Because one of the problems with, trial or scripts or application-based benchmarks is they're kind of measuring today. What about next year or the year after in my life cycle of my platform, right? Synthetic tests can test things like multi-thread a little bit. They could give a good indication of what might be expected in the future. So what are some of the characteristics of a good benchmark that you should look for? First of all, is it unbiased? Is there a lot of representation by different industry partners in that benchmark? And if there is, that those is not gamed or favored towards any particular vendor or any particular type of platform. And that'll give you a little better indication that it is kind of fair and balanced, and you can expect the results to be a little closer to reality. Is it transparent? Is it open and well-defined? Can you go out and see what kind of workloads is it measuring? How does it calculate that numerical comparative score that it kicks out? And if these details are disclosed, that gives you a good opportunity to evaluate that benchmark, say, this meets my criteria, or this looks a little suspect to the criteria I'm trying to measure. Application-based is utilizing applications that are relevant to the user experience, right? Is it measuring, Office apps that my constituents are using all the time, or is it measuring, something like a Gaussian photo blur? That might be very interesting if you're in the content creation business, but if you're in the general business, and your users are using, online collaboration tools and Office and those types of applications every day, that may be a little less relevant. Again, relevant user experience is similar. Does it map well to what you're looking to measure? Are those experiences something your users? And this is frankly a common ploy or common thing you'll see in a lot of the published benchmarks or online articles, right? They may, especially if they're from a particular vendor, right? They may be a little bit slanted towards what they're good at. So look at those workloads. Do those workloads represent what my users are going to be interested in, what I'm going to be interested in? And if they do, then great, they're of good value. If they don't, then they may be interesting, but treat it with a little less important. And finally, synthetic benchmarks, those can be comprised of a lot of smaller segments of code, so you have to be a little bit careful. A lot of times there'll be sub-scores that they roll up into a top-level score, and that's interesting. But you have to be a little bit careful if you look at some of those sub-component scores and put too much weight on those. I remember a few years back we were working on with a customer who was doing some evaluations, and they had a memory subtest score where one platform was 50% lower than the second platform they were looking at. And they were very concerned about that. But when you look at the application, when you looked at actual real world workloads running on it, the delta was small single digit difference. So that memory subtest was masked by things like a cache design, more memory potentially. So there was a lot of other factors in there that contributed to a user experience or a system level score that didn't necessarily correlate strongly to that one small subsection score. So again, it could be interesting, but don't apply too much weight on any one specific score, especially if it's a sub-score that's then aggregated up into a top-level result. So with that, I'm going to move on to another poll question. What types of benchmarks matter most to you or your customers, right? Is it productivity, office application? Is it pure CPU performance? Is it content creation? And a lot of this may be, relevant depending on what type of industry you're in. So I'm going to give it just a couple more seconds here, and then we will take a look at the results. All right, one last second to get your votes in, and okay, we're going to move on then and take a quick look at that. Oh, a pretty good mix across here, right? Productivity, that, as I'm not overly surprised, right? That is the purpose of these devices, right? Is to be productive in our work environment. And that is what we're trying to measure here. How can my users or myself be productive using these platforms? Office applications, about 50%. Again, that's what I would expect. Heavily weighted in the commercial segment, right? I guess I could have put gaming in here, but maybe that would have ranked a little lower for this audience. Although if you're a consumer, that might rank very high. So again, it'll depend on your things. Content creation, that's pretty interesting. That's fairly high up. And that'll be good as we look at kind of how to evaluate performance and what we do on one of the Ryzen PRO performance evaluations we'll look at here in just a few minutes. So let's go on and again explore this concept of, what makes a good benchmark and the transparency aspect of it. If a benchmark's transparent, you can go in and kind of look again, what type of workloads, what type of applications are they looking at? And you can see how they're weighted, right? And then you can make a determination. Are those workloads relevant to me, and are they weighted in the proper fashion for me? For example, here's a representation of a benchmark, right? That has a set of experiences that it's trying to measure. So we see here kind of a collection of other applications, call it roughly a third. Office applications, call it roughly a third, and almost half it was consumer video and photo editing. Again, if you're into the content creation or you're a consumer, this might be very relevant. But if I am a IT manager or a partner recommending a platform to a commercial customer, and they're looking at that office, that productivity one we saw in the previous poll question there, they may want to weight that office applications a little bit heavier than consumer video editing and photo editing. That may not be as relevant. So this benchmark, again, nothing necessarily wrong with it, but I may not want to put an over-reliance on it because of the heavy weight towards workloads, towards workflows that aren't particularly relevant to me. Again, if they are, then great. This one might be a heavier weighting in your overall evaluation criteria. So this is why the transparency of a benchmark is so critically important. It allows you to go in and take a look at that and say, okay, not necessarily a bad benchmark. It just may not fit the needs that I'm looking for, and it may be a data point, but one that I don't overemphasize too greatly. So let's talk about a few factors to consider when measuring performance, right? So there's a lot of variables that go into measuring performance. The OS version and background tasks, right? The operating system's getting better and better and spawning up a lot of tasks, a lot of threads are running, distributing them across the processor loads, and kind of like a butterfly effect, right? Run to run, that can vary because it's not necessarily purely deterministic. So run to run, you can see some variations because different things are going on at the OS at different times. So this may have some impact. Of course, background tasks, because if you're looking at the image that you're running, are there a lot of stuff going on in the background? Could be antivirus type stuff, could be a lot of different applications that could be running. The best practice is try to limit that as much as possible to streamline that variation. Software and firmware features, different OEMs have different features. Security is one, right? That can have an impact on performance. Again, if you're evaluating performance and there's certain security features that are critical for you, measure that performance with those security features turned on in all cases. And that will give you a indication of what your users will look at. But that can have a big impact, and make sure they're the same. That is one of the dangers with published benchmarks, right? Just make sure you can evaluate how the system was set up, what was running, right? Because it's hard to tell sometimes what are all those other variables. It can have a pretty dramatic impact on the results that are obtained. Environmental factors, right? What temperature? Especially in the notebook world, right? The thermal design of the platform can have a significant impact on the performance of the system, especially if your workloads tend to be longer in duration, right? Because the platform will heat up, and all those boost and base and boost frequencies we talked about earlier start to get changed dramatically. Multitasking is hard to benchmark, right? And we're moving to more and more multitasking, right? You got online collaboration, got a lot of web stuff. Maybe you're running a software compile or an Excel spreadsheet in the background, and multitasking helps spread out that error bar a little bit. It's very hard to make that deterministic because a lot of variables can change from run to run. So that's a fairly hard one. And here's where some of the synthetic benchmarks, because they try to isolate out other factors, and they can really measure that multi-threading performance of the processor and kind of give you a picture of the raw processing compute that will help you in the future as you start to multitask more, run multi-threaded applications more heavily. That will at least give you some indication that the processor will be able to handle those better in the future. Measurement error, this is a big one, and I'll talk a little bit more when I go into some of my evaluation of a particular processor in a moment. Run to run, all these variables, the OS, the software firmware we're running, the benchmarks themselves, the thermals, all can have, variations in runs to run. So you got to look at a little bit of a plus or minus, right? If one scores 100 and another's 105, 5%, that may not be very much of a difference. At AMD, when we do performance evaluations, we will run typically anywhere from 3 to 5 runs. We'll usually discard the high and low and then average the rest for a particular benchmark. This helps to smooth out some of those run-to-run measurement errors and give a little better indication of the performance. Performance versus balance mode. On the Windows slider right? Are you setting in balance mode, or are you setting in performance mode? Some platforms that doesn't make too much difference, but we've seen some platforms where on a processor level, that difference can be well outside of 10 and 15% difference between performance and balance mode. At the application level, it may be 5 to 10%, still fairly significant when you're looking at benchmarks and you're kind of trying to narrow down and quantify the delta. So look at that. Do I measure performance versus balance? Platform to platform may make differences. Make sure we're measuring it all the same. So let's go on and kind of look at what makes some best practices. So again, no single benchmark today can measure all aspects of a modern processor. So the best thing is to look at a wide range of tests. And I know that's not always easy and it's not always possible, but the smaller group of tests you do, the more, I guess, grain of salt you should take in the specific results on that, between the systems you're comparing. Because of all the factors I discussed, a 5 or 10% change may not be significant. If you can add more and more tests from different vendors that test different types of application versus synthetic processor versus system and application level, that gives you a better picture, and the more you can do, then the better picture you can get. Ensure that the benchmarks represent the types of workloads that are important. Again, if consumer photo editing is your bag, maybe that benchmark could be used, but again, maybe it's not the decision point for your evaluation. So again, I think the big one here is look at a multitude of benchmarks and run them multiple times and kind of get the average. And then look across a wide selection of benchmarks and kind of take a view of, okay, how many of this is winning? How many is it losing? Does that give me a good picture? Again, looking at synthetic application system level benchmarks. As the point 4 says, right? Use both synthetic and system level, application level. Because again, one can kind of give you a good read today. One can give you a good read of the raw processing power that may be available for the future that help give you a little bit more longevity in your purchase decision. So with all that in mind, let's kind of take a couple moments here to kind of look at a matchup here and look at a cross-section of benchmarks and how we might use those to start to help inform our purchase decision. So this is a fairly typical, what I'll call marketing, and I apologize for any of my marketing colleagues that are listening today, but kind of a marketing slide. This one's not too bad. It gives you a cross-section of different tests. And here I'm comparing a Ryzen 5 Pro 4650 against an i7 105. And you can see across the different tests here, I've chosen a fairly good cross-section. On the left-hand side, you have a PCMark 10 benchmark. This is a fairly good system-level type of benchmark. Within it, I have PCMark 10 productivity, so it gives you a little bit more office-oriented productivity type of view. Then they have the content creation piece of it. This gives a fairly good view of the content creators. Again, a fairly good return on our poll survey a moment ago. And then the two on the right are a little more of the synthetic processor. These kind of give me an indication of what may happen, the total raw processing power of the processors and how that might set me up for kind of future proofing, if you will, or for increasing or keep maintaining its performance, its user experience over the next few years as new applications and new workloads are introduced. So this isn't too bad. Again, it's decent, but it's still fairly narrow in scope. So what if I could expand that out? Again, I understand that it takes some effort and work, and that's not always possible. But the more I can expand it out, in the next view, and this is a little bit of an eye chart, but hopefully you can see it. Now I've taken that kind of marketing-ish where I have a handful of benchmarks. I've expanded this out to 28 different benchmarks across a whole wide variety of synthetic, application level, system level benchmarks, content creation, productivity, graphics, CPU. So now I have a wide selection of mixed set of tests from different publishers too, different vendors, a whole bunch of different vendors. Again, so if there's any vendor that may be slightly biased one way or another, I can look across a lot of vendors and I can kind of factor that out, or I can average out the sum of all of these. So what I did for my evaluation, again, given those factors we talked about earlier, the thermals, the run-to-run variations, I'm going to say plus or minus 5%, I'm going to consider a tie. So if it's within 5% of each other, that, given all those variables, given the fact that a lot of times benchmarks aren't necessarily directly correlated to user experience, I'm going to call that a tie. Now, if it's better than 5%, I'm going to give it a slight nod to the processor that's, plus 5% on the performance. And the same thing, if it's below 5%, I'm going to give a slight nod to the other processor. So when I run, in this case, the Ryzen 5 Pro 4650 against an i7 106 Comet Lake, two currently available commercial processors in the market, I look across all 28 of those tests. And you can I call it the good, the bad, and the ugly slide, right? You can see, where it's good, where there's ties, and where it's not so good. And I kind of lump those according to my evaluation criteria. And when you look at the Ryzen 5 versus this i7, 25% of these benchmarks, these 28 benchmarks, the i7 is going to be at least 5% faster. 21% of the time, they were both within 5 plus or minus 5% of each other. And 54% of the tests, the Ryzen 5 is greater than 5% faster than the i7. So tie or faster for the Ryzen 5 is roughly 3/4 of these 28 different tests. Again, across a wide selection of vendors, benchmark types. So again, I'm not going to say, the one is superior to the other, but this gives me a good indication looking at a wide number of benchmarks, right? Across all kinds of different tests. I'm going to say that Ryzen 5 is at least as good as that i7, and in certain circumstances, it's probably better. And certainly, if I was evaluating these two platforms, these might be two of my finalists, and I definitely want to take a long, hard look at that Ryzen 5 because it appears on this wide selection of benchmarks, it's going to give me some outstanding performance and good, future proofing as I look at some of the processor benchmark. So this is a way to kind of, again, smooth out some of those one benchmark may favor or one benchmark doesn't measure everything. By looking at a whole group of benchmarks, I now can kind of, I'll call it average. You can't really average the scores because they don't correlate benchmark to benchmark. But you can kind of do an eyeball view here, set this evaluation criteria, and then kind of make a judgment call that, yeah, I'm thinking that Ryzen 5 is probably going to be a little bit faster than that i7. And I think we're at the end here. So again, I hope we got some tidbits of useful information here as we look across a wide selection of benchmarks, look at the different types of benchmarks, how to evaluate a benchmark, make sure it's measuring the type of workloads that you want, make sure that you're getting a good cross-section there. So again, appreciate your time this morning, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much, Chuck. It was so great learning about all of these wonderful performance benchmarks for Ryzen Pro. And everyone, if you're looking to actually click this link, it's in our resource center, so please check that out. All right, so we'll get to some questions today. Let's jump right on in. Please open up that Q&A widget and submit your question now. The first question I do want to ask for you, Chuck, one of our audience members wants to know, what about performance in the Corona renderer?
I'm not familiar with the Corona renderer, so I will have to get back to on that one. Again, I think, if I just look at the general philosophy here, what is it measuring? What type of workloads? If that's critical to your workflow, then maybe you put more weight on that. And certainly there's optimizations that go into benchmarks. I mean, AMD works with many of these benchmark providers, as well as the ISVs themselves, right? Because it's not just about a benchmark score, it's also about the real application running faster. So that can be part of the evaluation criteria. But we can get some more information on that.
Great, thank you, Chuck. We'll get to another question here. What types of performance evaluation do you see your customers doing most often?
Yeah, I think, the typical benchmarks are certainly high on the list, right? The usual collection of different mainstream benchmarks and commercial, I would have to say those tend to be the PassMark family, the PCMark 10 family, SysMark is popular often, and each has their strengths and weaknesses. Again, look at those and figure out how they relate to your workflow and your work or your organization. I also see customers a lot of time using real-world office applications. Excel being probably the most popular one, where people run large Excel spreadsheets. That tends to be the most. And again, AMD is working on a Office script where we will go through all the different types of Office and create an Office workflow and allow you to evaluate that way.
Awesome. Thank you, Chuck. So we're at time today. So if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, please feel free to email us through the Contact Us widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you once again, Chuck, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And at the close of this webinar, you guys will see a short survey, and we would love to get your feedback, so please complete it. And thank you all again for joining. And feel free to register for our upcoming webinar on Monday the 19th, where we'll be discussing the recently released AMD Power Chromebooks. So please be sure to register now. We look forward to